In a fair democracy, everyone's vote should count equally, but the method that the United States uses to elect its president, called the Electoral College, violates this principle by making sure that some people's votes are more equal than others. The Electoral College is, essentially, the 538 votes that determine who wins the presidency. If these votes were split evenly across the population, every 574,000 people would be represented by one vote. But that's not what happens because the Electoral College doesn't give votes to people, only states, which has some unfair consequences. For example, there are 11.5 million people in Ohio, so, to fairly represent them, it should get 20 electoral votes. But the Electoral College doesn't give Ohio 20 votes, it only gets 18, 2 less than it should. Where'd those other votes go? To states like Rhode Island. Plucky Rhode Island has 1.1 million people in it, so it should have about 2 votes, but instead it gets 4. Those extra 2 votes that should be representing Ohioans go to representing Rhode Islanders instead. Why? Because, according to the rules of the Electoral College, every state, no matter how few people live there, gets 3 votes to start with before the rest are distributed according to population. Because of this rule, there are a lot of states with a few people that should only have 1 or 2 votes for president but instead get 3 or 4. So Georgians, Virginians, Michiganders, and Jerseyites are each missing 1 vote. Pennsylvanians, North Carolinians, Ohioans, and Hoosiers are missing 2, Floridians are missing 4, New Yorkers 5, Texans 6, and Californians are 10 votes short of what they should get. Because of this vote redistribution, the Electoral College essentially pretends that fewer people live where they do and more people live where they don't. An American who lives in one of these states has their vote for president count for less than an American who lives in one of these states. In some cases, the Electoral College bends the results just a little, but if you live in a particularly large or small state, it bends them a lot. One Vermonter's vote, according to the Electoral College, is worth 3 Texans' votes, and one Wyomingite's vote is worth 4 Californians. Now whoa, hold on there, son, you might be saying to yourself right now. You're missing the whole point of the Electoral College, is to protect the small states from the big states. Give the small states more voting power and the presidential candidates will have to pay them more attention in an election. If that's the goal of the Electoral College, it's failing spectacularly. Here's a graph showing the number of visits the presidential candidates paid to each of the states in the last 2 months of the previous election. If it looks like there are a few states missing, you're right. Only 18 of the 50 states received even a single visit from a candidate, and just 2 of those states, Maine and New Hampshire, have very small populations. The area of the country with the most small states is conspicuously missing. The Electoral College doesn't make candidates care about small states. But interestingly, the biggest states, California, Texas, and New York, are missing as well. So what's going on? Looking closer, just 4 states, Ohio, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, received a majority of the candidates' attention during the election. And if you follow the money, it's the same story. Why do candidates spend so much money and time in so few states? Because the way the Electoral College works forces them to do so. The elections are winner take all. As long as a candidate gets just over 50% of the popular vote in a state, he wins 100% of that state's electoral votes. That means winning by millions of citizens' votes is no better than winning by a single vote, so candidates are safe to ignore states where they poll with big margins. Instead, the Electoral College makes candidates intensely interested in the needs of just a few states with close races to the detriment of almost all Americans, which is why it should be abolished. But wait, you might say, won't abolishing the Electoral College and voting directly for president cause candidates to spend all their time in big cities? That wouldn't be fair to most Americans either. This sounds like a reasonable fear, but ignores the mathematical reality of population distribution. There are 309 million people in the United States, only 8 million of which live in New York, the largest city by far. That's 2.6% of the total population. But after New York, the size of cities drops fast. LA has 3.8 million people and Chicago has 2.7. But you can't even make it to the 10th biggest city, San Jose, before you're under 1 million people. These top 10 cities added together are only 7.9% of the popular vote, hardly enough to win an election. And even winning the next 90 biggest cities in the United States all the way down to Spokane is still not yet 20% of the total population. So unless there's a city with a few 100 million people hiding somewhere in America that's been left out of the census, the idea that a candidate can just spend their campaign jetting between New York, LA, and Chicago while ignoring everyone else and still become president is mathematically ludicrous. Hello Internet. Let's talk about this map, this argument, and the Electoral College in general. In my Trouble with the Electoral College video from 2011, I was wrong to use the city limits for that part of the argument, rather than the more expansive metro area. The lawyerish nerd inside of me still wants to argue technically correct on that one. I use the city boundaries because the metro areas are often vague and absurdly large. The New York metro area is 6,700 plus square miles over 4 states, and from where I partly grew up, it seemed that a lot of that area had nothing to do with New York City proper. So at the time, I disregarded the metro boundaries. But using the strict city boundaries in that that video was the wrong decision in retrospect. In addition to being a bad argument to make, it also doesn't address the concerns this map express. And this is correct. Half the population does live in the gray counties. And more than that, the map gets at a fundamental division in the United States and other countries that leads partly to the politics we see, the difference between the rural and the urban. If trends continue, a higher and higher percentage of the country will live in urban areas. In another 8 or 16 years, this map will be even more extreme. The metro areas even denser, which, if you're in favor of the Electoral College, will seem like even more of a reason to keep it. Now, this is where we must discuss the idea that the Electoral College ensures the president is elected by the states. It doesn't. A candidate can win the Electoral College with just the 11 biggest states. This collection may seem unlikely, but as urbanization and the politics it creates continues, it becomes increasingly likely. The Electoral College doesn't ensure the president wins with a lot of states or even geographically diverse states. Now, should the president represent the people or should the president represent the states is a question without an answer. This is about preference in style of governance. One moves power up to the federal level and the other moves power down to the states. And given the vastness of the country and the difference in her geographies, it's reasonable to believe that states with greater power is the better, less divisive solution to the problem of governance. But the Electoral College does nothing to help that. It happens to be that recent wins have been geographically spread, but the Electoral College doesn't ensure that outcome. Cram everyone into California, leaving one person in each state, and the Electoral College says California alone, she decides. We could have a system where the president must win a majority of the states, which is what some think the Electoral College is, but it isn't. The election only happens to make it look that way. The protection of the Electoral College is only an illusion. Even if you still like the Electoral College, though it doesn't actually protect the small states, the Electoral College still comes with the most bitter of anti-republic pills. For even if you win the election in November, your victory can be taken away from you in December. The Electoral College votes your state gets aren't really votes, but are individual members of the political parties who perform the real vote for president in December. No citizen voted for these electors to cast a vote on their behalf, and many of the electors are free to vote for whoever they want. Their election in December is the real election. The Electoral College was designed to be able to overwrite the will of the people or its own election process anytime enough of a small number of unknown, unelected political party insiders don't like the result they got. If you're in favor of the Electoral College, you have to accept that by its own rules, it can take away your victory under the guise of protecting you from yourself. This has never happened in American history, nor should it, but it is crazy to leave in place for future elections a system that benefits no citizens and protects no states. It's time to get rid of the Electoral College and have a real discussion about what a modern government and election system should look like.
Want to see the real way to unfairly win? How you can become president with only 22% of the popular vote by taking advantage of the Electoral College today. Don't believe that's possible in a democracy? Just watch. Here's the action plan. Win the votes of the people who count the most and ignore the people who count the least. Start with Wyoming, the state where 0.18% of Americans live, but who get 0.56% of the Electoral College votes for president. And because it's a winner-take-all system, you don't need all of them to vote for you, just half plus one, or 0.09%. Next up is the District of Columbia, where winning 0.1% of the population gets you an additional 0.56% of the Electoral College. Then add in wins in Vermont and North Dakota and Alaska. Notice how the votes you're getting to win the presidency go up much faster than the percent of the population who voted for you because of the Electoral College's rules. Next is South Dakota, then Delaware, Montana, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Maine, Hawaii, Idaho, Nebraska, West Virginia, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Kansas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Iowa, Connecticut, Oklahoma, Oregon, Kentucky, Louisiana, South Carolina, Alabama, Colorado, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Maryland, Missouri, Tennessee, Arizona, Indiana, Massachusetts, Virginia, and New Jersey.
Congratulations! By taking advantage of the unfair rules and winning states, not people, you've won a majority in the Electoral College even though 78% of the population voted against you. This is not democracy, this is indefensible. While this particular scenario is unlikely, if you have a voting system that allows losers to win, you shouldn't be surprised when they do. Not once, not twice, but thrice in American history, the candidate with the most votes from the people actually lost because of the Electoral College.
4 times now. This has happened 4 times.
3 errors in 55+ elections is a failure rate of 5%.
7%.
Would anyone tolerate a sport where, by a quirk of the rules, there was a
7%.
chance that the loser would win? Not likely. Given how much more important electing the President of the United States is, that's a rather dangerously high percentage of the time to get it wrong. If we abolish the Electoral College and simply let citizens vote for the President directly, all of these problems will go away and everyone's vote will be equal. Let's say you want to become Pope, head of the Catholic Church, and shepherd to over 1 billion faithful. What requirements must you have for this lofty position? First, be a Catholic, and second, be a man. Which seems a little thin, and while it's technically possible for a regular Sunday Catholic to become Pope, the last time this happened was essentially never, because becoming Pope isn't like becoming president. You can't just run for office. Selecting the Pope is an inside job, and the men who do it are the cardinals, and while in theory they can select any Catholic man to become Pope, in practice they prefer to elevate one of their own. The last time a non-cardinal became Pope was more than 600 years ago, so while it isn't an official requirement, it's an unofficial official requirement. Thus, in order to become Pope, you'll first need to be a cardinal, and to do that, you need to start climbing the Catholic corporate ladder. Step 1. Become a priest. Unlike some churches where you can just fill out a form online and poof, ordained, the Catholic Church treats becoming a priest as a real, you-need-training profession, so you're going to require a lot of education, usually a college degree in Catholic philosophy and then a master's in divinity. In addition to your educational qualifications, you must also be a man, unmarried, and willing to remain celibate. If you meet these requirements and have been working with the church, then you can be officially ordained as a priest, which basically means you get to run a Catholic church or work with another priest who does. But you want to move onward, and to do that you need to take the job of the man who just made you a priest. Step 2. Become a bishop. Bishops are a much more select group. While there are about 400,000 Catholic priests worldwide, there are only about 5,000 bishops. While priests get churches, bishops get cathedrals, from which they oversee a number of local churches. To advance your career, you must wait for a bishop in your area to be forced into retirement at age 75 or die sooner than that, freeing up space for you. But you can't just apply, because there's already a secret list of potential bishops that's updated every 3 years based on who the current bishops in your area think would make a good replacement for one of their own. To be on that list, in addition to the obvious requirement of being a pious person, you should also be at least 35 years old, have been a priest for at least 5 years, and have a doctorate in theology or equivalent. Assuming you're all these things, your name may or may not be on the secret list. The local bishops then give that list to the Pope's ambassador for your country, known as the Apostolic Nuncio. The Nuncio picks 3 priests from the list, does in-depth research on them, conducts interviews, and selects the one he thinks is best. But it's not over, because the Nuncio sends his report to Vatican City and the Congress of Bishops who work there, reviewing potential appointments from around the world. If the Congress of Bishops doesn't like any of the 3 candidates, they can tell the Nuncio to start over, returning to the list, picking another 3 candidates, doing more research, more interviews, and sending off the results. When the Congress of Bishops is happy with one of the Nuncio's candidates, that name is given to the Pope, who can reject the candidate and start the whole process over. It shouldn't be a surprise that from vacancy to a bishop's replacement can take months and on occasion years. But assuming a bishop in your area retired or died at the right time, and you were on the secret list of good priests, and the Nuncio picked you, and you made it through his interview, and the Congress of Bishops approved you, and the Pope didn't veto you, poof, now you're a bishop. But you're still not on top. The penultimate promotion is step number 3, become a cardinal. Despite the fancy name and snazzy red outfits to match, cardinals are not the bosses of bishops. They are bishops, just with an additional title and additional responsibilities, the most notable of which is electing the new pope. The only way to become a cardinal is to get the current pope to appoint you as one, and of the 5,000 bishops, only about 200 are ever cardinals. But let's say your ambition doesn't go unnoticed by the pope and he makes you a cardinal. Now it's time to play the waiting game for his death or retirement, and with popes, death is vastly more likely. When either happens, the cardinals under the age of 80 are brought to Vatican City, where they are isolated from the outside world, presumably by taking away their cell phones and tablets and carrier pigeons. Once sequestered, the election of a new pope can begin. These elections are never exactly the same because the ex-pope leaves instructions on how he wants his replacements to be picked, but in general it works like this. 4 times a day, the cardinals go to the Sistine Chapel to vote, and to become pope, one of them must get a 2/3 majority. There's a big dose of mustn't be too hasty here, as the cardinals don't just raise their hands or use a modern preferential voting system, but instead write down one name on a piece of paper, stand before the altar, and say a long Latin phrase before officially casting the ballot. Once all the cardinals have done this, the votes are counted and then burned. This is why TV news stations covering the election of Pope use super modern HD live streaming cameras to look at a chimney. If the smoke is black, no new pope. The high victory threshold and tediously slow voting process is why it takes so long to elect a pope. It's usually at least 2 weeks of voting, 4 times a day, 6 days a week, with 1 day a week reserved for prayer, but the record length is 3 years. Assuming you eventually win the support of your fellow cardinals, you have one final thing to do before becoming pope. Pick yourself a new name. There's no formal rule, and you can name yourself anything you like, but it's tradition to take the name of a previous pope. Upon the acceptance of your new name, the final ballots are burned clean to make the smoke turn white and announce to the world that a new pope has been selected. So that's the career path. Be born into the right half of the population, become one of 1 billion Catholics, then one of 400,000 priests, then one of 5,000 bishops, then one of 200 cardinals, wait for the current pope to die or retire, and convince 2/3 of your fellow cardinals to select you as the one, the only pope.